The story revolves around Dieu Han, a woman from an ethnic minority group, quietly raising her young child, Tom, alone in a land of constant sun, wind, and relentless challenges. Han's life has been fraught with difficulties since her ex-husband fell into gambling and alcoholism, accumulating debts and eventually facing legal troubles, leaving her not only with a void in her marriage but also a heavy burden of debt she didn't cause. Amidst these overwhelming misfortunes, Han doesn't complain, nor does she allow herself to give up. She quietly lives on, bracing herself to move forward each day. When strong winds knock down her vegetable patches and okra trellises, she bends down, using her calloused hands to prop up each bamboo stake and tie the stems back together, as if mending her own life. Illness silently afflicts her, her body worn down by exhausting labor. But for the sake of food and clothing, for her young child, Han refuses to stop even for a single day. In the morning, she carried her basket of longan to the market, standing discreetly amidst the bustling crowd. In the evening, she counted every meager penny of profit, carefully saving up to buy rice and a little meat, then hurried to pick Tom up before dark. Life passed by in hardship, but never without love. Despite being alone in her simple house, Han still maintained the customs of her homeland. In the last days of the year, she quietly prepared smoked meat for Tet Lunar New Year, the hazy smoke lingering in the cold air, as if clinging to the warmth of family, so that Tom could still have a complete and loving Tet, even though his mother's life was still full of hardship. Unexpectedly, that fragile, peaceful atmosphere was suddenly shattered when Miss Bin suddenly arrived. Without a word of greeting, the woman stood right in front of the house, loudly cursing and slandering, each word like a knife cutting straight into Dieu Han's heart. Miss Bin didn't just demand money. The chilling threats, aimed directly at little Tom's safety, left Han speechless. Before her lay a crumpled promissory note, clearly bearing her ex-husband's signature proof that rendered all of Han's explanations meaningless. Miss Bin snarled, demanding Han pay 50 million dong, a debt she had never borrowed and never even known about. Han collapsed, pleading desperately, explaining that she had no connection to the debt, that her husband was in prison, that she was just a poor single mother, but all her pleas fell on deaf ears. Miss Bin became increasingly aggressive, smashing things and threatening to make a big fuss if Han didn't pay. Afraid of her child being hurt, afraid of the trauma etched into little Tom's innocent childhood, Han had no way out. Trembling, she gathered all her meager savings money stained with sweat and tears and silently handed it to Miss Bin as collateral. But to the creditor, that amount was merely interest. Miss Bin coldly declared, 1 month, that was all the time Han had to pay off the principal. Otherwise, she would come back to cause trouble again. When the creditor's figure disappeared down the red dirt road, Han collapsed in the ruined house. All her strength seemed to have drained away. She hugged her child, tears silently falling, her heart filled with unanswered questions. Where would she get the money to pay off the debt? How would she provide for her child? Tet Lunar New Year was approaching, while Han faced only a bleak future, heavy with anxiety and despair. Han was consumed by constant anxiety, her body exhausted after days of burden, her mind suffocated by a massive debt she had never borrowed. Even though her marriage had ended, that cruel thread still tightened around Han's life, offering her no escape. Miss Bin, the loan shark, appeared more and more frequently in Han's nightmares. The constant threats, the cold, coercive words like invisible knives, forced her to take on a debt of 50 million dong, a sum far beyond the means of a single woman living off the meager income of the market. Meanwhile, the actual principal debt was only about 20 million, the rest being compound interest, a ruthless and merciless act. Every night, after her child had fallen asleep, Han sat silently in the darkness, counting the coins, then letting go in helplessness. She wondered why someone else's mistake had become a hanging sentence on her life. Wanting to give up, but looking at little Tom's innocent face, Han gritted her teeth and endured. Exhaustion gradually eroded her will, but deep down, the fear of losing her child, the fear of her future being stifled, still urged Han to stand firm. Even though she faced a dead end, she understood that she couldn't collapse because behind her was a small life depending on her. Alongside the heavy burden of debt, Han's daily life was filled with hardship with her young son, Tom. Day after day, she cared for her child, prepared meager meals, and tried to maintain a calm demeanor in front of him. Despite her inner turmoil, Han forced a smile because she understood that Tom was her only support, the reason she continued to endure and not allow herself to give up. When all paths seemed closed, in her moment of greatest despair, Han turned to Miss Men with the faint hope of borrowing some money to make ends meet. However, the amount was too large, beyond Miss Men. Main's means. She could only gather a small sum, a meager amount of capital needed to buy goods to make a living. Seeing the thin banknotes in Miss Main's hand, Han felt a pang of sadness and shook her head, refusing the money. She couldn't bear to take away someone else's last source of livelihood to alleviate her own suffering. Han quietly left, carrying an even heavier burden of sorrow. But behind her, Miss Main couldn't rest easy. That same afternoon, she secretly called Dan, arranging an urgent meeting. Upon hearing Han's story, Dan didn't hesitate, rushing to her house to inquire. In front of Dan, Han still tried to hide the debt, only vaguely mentioning that she was tired of life. But Han's vacant eyes and anxious demeanor didn't escape his keen observation. Sensing the worry gnawing away at her day by day, Dan decided not to stand idly by. He proactively confronted Miss Bin, frankly pointing out that lending money at exorbitant interest rates and forcing repayments far exceeding the principal amount was a violation of the law. Dan warned that if Miss Bin continued to threaten and intimidate Han, he would report it to the authorities for intervention. Although reassured that Han had no legal obligation to repay the debt, her heart remained heavy. The guilt wouldn't go away, because Han feared that Miss Bin's anger would be directed at the landlord, or her former mother-in-law, an elderly woman burdened with illness and the shock of learning about her son's deep debt. This very kindness, forbearance, and constant consideration for others became a heavy burden on Han's already fragile shoulders, making her life even more difficult and her future more uncertain than ever. Towards the end of the story, Don didn't say much, just quietly stayed by Han's side, caring for her in the smallest ways. A warm meal was neatly placed on the table, while Han was still trying to lull her child to sleep. A thick blanket was added on the cold night wind, shielding her from the chill seeping through the thin walls of the house. These seemingly ordinary things warmed Han's heart quietly, because it had been so long since she had felt such selfless protection. As night fell, the space was enveloped in silence, but the unease still lingered. Remembering the earlier threats, Dan decided to stay late, quietly sitting on the porch, keeping watch. He feared that Bin might hire someone to sabotage or harm Han and her child. In the darkness, even the smallest sound was enough to make Han's heart ache. But knowing Don was still there, made her feel less alone. Tom slept peacefully in his mother's arms, his breathing even, his innocent face untouched by the worries of an adult. Looking at her son, then at the figure of the man sitting silently on the porch, Han suddenly realized that even amidst the harshest times, life still quietly bestows kindness upon us. The story concludes in a tense yet warm atmosphere. Although many uncertainties lie ahead, and the storm of debt hasn't truly subsided, Han feels somewhat more at ease. Because beside her and Tom, there are still good people ready to protect them, so that the mother and son don't have to face the darkness alone.